Right, hello and welcome guys, and in this tutorial video we will be demonstrating how to exploit a specific vulnerability using the Metasploit framework. So I've got my Kali Linux machine, and I've also got my Windows 7 lab machine, as you can see. So to begin with, I've already done a net discover, but I'll do that again. So the first thing you want to do is to do an if config. So this is the IP address of my Kali Linux, and I'm going to perform a net discover. Alright, so put a net discover on my network address to find out the IP address of my Windows 7. So if you remember from last time, we did a vulnerability scan using OpenVAS, and here are the results from my previous vulnerability scan. So I did one for my Windows 7 lab machine and also the Linux Kong virtual machine. So going back to my scan, I can confirm this is the IP address of my Windows because that's the only virtual machine I've got running. And if I go to my scan results, this is the results that we had last time. So let's look at the vulnerability we're looking to exploit. Click on the high vulnerabilities, and as you can see, the one I'm after is the MS17010. So this vulnerability, like I explained to you last time, is also known as the Eternal Blue vulnerability, which was exploited by the ransomware called WannaCry in 2017. So this vulnerability affected the Microsoft Server Message Block, the SMB, running on port 445. You can read more about this. So if we open this link, we can find out more about this. I don't know why this is showing MS0112. It should be MS010. Let's have a look. Yes, so this is the critical vulnerability. If you Google this, for instance, saying what is MS17010, I believe. We can read about this exploit. That this exploit is actually, or this vulnerability is also known as another name called Eternal Blue. Microsoft exploit, which was used by the NSA in intelligence gathering operations. So this exploit officially named MS17010. So you can read more about this Eternal Blue vulnerability and how it was exploited by the ransomware WannaCry in 2017. So how do we go about exploiting this vulnerability? We go back to our Kali Linux and we launch the Metasploit framework. So you do msfdb. So this is to start the Metasploit framework. So MSF means Metasploit framework database run, and this will start the Metasploit framework database and to load up the framework that we can use to exploit the Windows 7 lab machine. So as you can see, it's saying starting Metasploit framework, and you can see here it's loaded 2,242 exploits. We've got 1,184 auxiliary, 398 post exploits. We've got 867 payload. So all of this are exploits, auxiliaries, and different exploit modules or different modules built into the Metasploit framework. I'm using the Metasploit framework version 6. Probably if you update yours, it might be MSF7. So there are different versions. I'm using MSF6 version here, and we dropped into this console. So you can normally run Linux command, so clear screen for instance, and what I'm going to do next is I'm going to search for Eternal Blue. When I search for Eternal Blue, you can see the keyword Eternal Blue has been identified, and we can also see exploits for the MS17010. You could do a search as well probably search for MS17, and if we search for this, we'll probably be able to see some of these exploits again. As you can see, the eternal blue. All right, so the keyword you use to search is important in terms of searching for the right exploit you want to use. So I'm going to go back to the eternal blue because that's the one I prefer to use. And if we have a look in here, we have an exploit 0, exploit 1, and we also have auxiliary modules, and we also have another exploit. So we have 4 or 5 different modules that we can use that match the search term eternal blue. So what does an auxiliary module do? An auxiliary module is you can use it to scan to find out if a specific target is vulnerable to a specific vulnerability. So you can use to confirm this vulnerability that we found. So let's try this exploit module to see if this will work. So I'm going to go for this auxiliary module to see what it tells us. Or we can go for the scanner. Let's try the scanner one because this one tells us that it is used for SMB remote code execution detection. So let's try this. So in order to do this, you can say use 3. So you're saying use the number 3. And straight away we see that is loaded up that module, auxiliary module. And then when we do options, we're presented with the options that we need to put in. So the ones you need to focus on are the ones that say yes. If anything is yes, it means that it is required that you set that specific parameter. So our port is 445. This is the port that we want to exploit. That has been set for us by default. Our host is the IP address of the target. All right, the IP address of the target that we want to exploit. We don't need to put in a username and password. I think those are the only requirements here that we need to set. So our host is what we need to set. So we can say set our host. All right, remember our host with an S, and then we put in the IP address of our Windows machine, which is from my vulnerability scan. It is 192.168.219.137. 168.219.137. Click on enter. Now if I do options again, we can see that parameter has been set. So all we have to do now, we could type in exploit, or you can type in run. So remember, like I said, this is a scanner. It's going to scan for vulnerabilities. Another way to know what this is doing is you can type in the word info and read exactly what that specific module does. So this is saying, the description tells us that the machine does not have the MSA patch. This will check if this specific machine is vulnerable. So if you read the description, that is exactly what this does. So you can see it says also known as double pulsar or eternal blue. So let's just type in run, see what happens. And you can see the result is the host is likely vulnerable to MS70010 and tells us the name of the operating system of the target. So likely vulnerable. So this is just confirming what we already know from our initial vulnerability scan. So in other words, you can use the Metasploit framework to sort of like perform a vulnerability scan. So this is like a specific vulnerability scan using this module. So let's clear screen. Now that we confirm that it's exactly vulnerable, what we can then do is we can go to back, and then we can search again for eternal blue. Now we need to pick and choose. Sometimes you might have to do, process of elimination. Sometimes you might have to try multiple exploits to see the one that works. So we do have different ones, but I've done this before and I know that the exploit that actually works is this specific exploit, which is the PS-exec exploit is the one I'm going to go for. So I'm going to go for use 1. And when we click on enter, we can see that this is an exploit module. which was different from the auxiliary module we used before. So now we've loaded an exploit module. You can see Metasploit gives us the default payload. So it chooses a payload for us, and by default it uses the Meterpreter payload. So from the lectures I would have mentioned to you that by default Metasploit framework uses the Meterpreter payload. So here it has loaded a payload for us, or selected a payload by default to the Meterpreter reverse TCP. So this will allow us to get a Meterpreter reverse shell. Okay, so let's look at options. What options have we got? So if we scroll down to the top, which ones are the ones required? Yes, so this has already been set. So again, we need to set the R host, which is the host that we want to exploit, the remote, the target. And what else do we need to set? So by default, sometimes you might find out that you have to set this parameter hell host as well. So hell host will be the IP address of your Kali Linux machine. Okay, hell host, Kali Linux machine. By default, the ports that we want to receive are reverse shell, but sometimes you have to set the hell host. So if you want to set the hell host, you have to just do set hell host and type in the IP address of your Kali Linux. So all we have to do first here is to set the har hosts. Remember, har host is the IP address of our Windows 7 lab machine that we want to exploit. So again, I'm going to type in the IP address 192.168.219.137. Yours definitely is going to be different, so make sure you confirm, find out the IP address using NetDiscover before you then proceed. So when I click on enter and I do options, we can see the parameters are set. Yes, this has already been set by default. The R port has already been set. This is the only parameter you have to set for this. And then you can just do run, or you can type in exploit. Both do the same thing. So when I hit exploit, you can see it started a reverse shell and we got a shell. This is a Meterpreter shell. So it says session opened, we got a shell on the box. Now we've managed to compromise the Windows 7 lab machine remotely. So one thing you can do here is a Meterpreter shell gives you different options. So if we type in help, we can see the different commands that we can run. We can record the mic, we can turn on somebody's webcam using the Meterpreter shell. But what we want to do is to get a proper shell. So one of the commands that we need here is the shell command. If I can find where the shell command is. I think it's on the file systems, is it? I can't remember where it is, but you can search for that to find out exactly what it is. And I am going to just type in the shell command. So when I type in shell from my Meterpreter shell, you can see now I have a Windows shell. So remotely, we've been able to exploit that vulnerability, and now we have a shell, a Windows shell on our Kali Linux. Let's confirm ipconfig to be sure, and you can see the IP address is exactly the IP address of our Windows 7 lab machine. We can confirm that we have a shell. Now that is the exact machine we've exploited. So here, if we do an ipconfig, you can see the IP address 137 is the same. So very easy to use Metasploit framework like we've done here. Load the right exploit, set the parameters, and just type in the word exploit, and we have a shell. We can do other commands like dir, or we can do things like who am I, and it tells us we are NT authority system. So we actually the administrator. These exploits allowed us to become the administrator on this specific target machine. Okay. Now, if you type in exit, it will take you back to the Meterpreter shell. You still have a shell on the box. We can do something like, let's see if we can take a screenshot. Grab a screenshot of the desktop. So let's see if we will be able to grab a screenshot of this using the shell. So I'm just going to type in screenshot. And you can see it saved the screenshot to here. So let's go into this directory in our folder. And this is a screenshot. Can you see that? So remotely, we have access to the machine and we can actually take a screenshot of the desktop remotely using the Meterpreter shell. So that is one of the advantages of Meterpreter. Meterpreter allows us to do more things. It gives us more functionalities. We can turn on the webcam if this was a real machine on somebody's computer. We have a shell with a Meterpreter shell. We can turn on the webcam. We can record using the microphone. And we can perform all of these activities without the target even having any sort of knowledge that we have access to their machine. So I'm able to take the screenshot, as you can see. So you can exit, and that takes you back to your Metasploit framework module. So that session is closed. If you type in exploit again, we'll get another shell, this time around on session 2. So again, we can exit and we can come back to get a shell. So that is the Meterpreter shell, and that's what it looks like. So familiarize yourself with the with this exploit and make sure you're able to perform this. So I'm going to exit this. I'm going to clear screen. Now, some commands like options shows you the parameters you need to set. We also have some options like show targets. Now, by default, Metasploit gave us the target 0 automatic. Sometimes you might have to set your target depending on some certain scenarios. So sometimes you might run some exploits and they don't work out of the box. It might be that the target you're trying to exploit needs to be the exact match. You might have to set targets. So you might have to do something like set target and then select the right target, maybe 1, 2, 3 or 0. So by default, this was already set to 0, so that we are fine. So let's go back to options. You can see that this is the payload, like I mentioned, by default. So let's say we want to use a different payload that is not a Meterpreter payload. We can do show payloads, and Metasploit is going to show us a list of payloads that we can select from. All right, a list of payloads that we can select from. So I am going to go for a normal shell rather than a Meterpreter shell. We can select a normal reverse shell. So I'm going to look for one that is not a is not a Meterpreter shell. So we could see we have a bind, we have a reverse. I'm looking for a reverse shell. So here I'm looking for perhaps this one. Okay, so if you remember in the lecture notes, I mentioned that we can choose a staged and a non-staged payload. So I am going to go for this staged payload. So I'm going to select this payload, going to copy this. Then I'm going to go back to my module. Let's clear screen. Okay, remember if you type in options, we can actually see the payload. So now I'm going to set a different payload. So I'm going to do set payload. I'm going to paste this. Click on enter. Now you can see the payload that we've been selected is this. Now if we run options again, you can see the payload has changed. Okay, so let's run exploit and see what happens this time around. So this time around, it is a stage payload, like I mentioned, but it is not a Meterpreter payload. So let's see what type of shell we get. So that took a while, and eventually you can see we have a Windows shell. So we didn't have a Meterpreter shell like we did before. If you remember in the example we did before, by default we got a Meterpreter, but in this instance it just dropped us into a normal Windows shell. So again, we can confirm that this is the right shell. As you can see, the IP address matches the machine that we exploited. If you type in exit this time around, it takes you directly out back into the exploit module. If we run exploit again, it's going to perform the exploit again and drop us back into a normal shell. So that is the difference between a Meterpreter payload and a normal payload. So the payload that we use in this sort of scenario is a normal payload, and a stage payload, and again, after a while, it should drop us back into a shell. It might take some few seconds, or you might have to hit enter on your keyboard and give it a while, and eventually it will give you a normal shell. So depending on the scenario, sometimes you might have to select your own payload. As you can see, we have a shell. Okay, so there's another type of payload that I mentioned and this is a non-stage payload, and the only difference is the way the command is written, or the payload is written. So I'm just going to pull up my notes for references to make sure I don't get it wrong. And for that one, all we need is just an underscore for this, and click on enter. You can see if you do options, it set the payload to this, and same thing as this. You could do run instead of exploit, and again after a while it should drop us into a shell. So by default, what I wanted to take away is, by default, if you don't set the payload, Metasploit will set a payload for you, and that is fine. I do prefer Meterpreter payload because you can do a lot of post-exploitation, such as turning on a webcam, finding a file, downloading a file, using the Meterpreter payload. And when we do post-exploitation, I'm going to talk you through and show you more about how you can use the Meterpreter shell to perform some post-exploitation. So I'm just going to wait for this to drop into a shell. And I think that's just about it. As you can see as well, now we have a shell, and we can say if IP config, we can confirm that we have this. So this is basically how to use Metasploit framework to exploit the SMB MS17 vulnerability that we found using OpenVAS. So if you manage to get this far, you're able to do this, the next thing I will want you to do as part of your tasks, so if we go to tasks, let's log in again, is to exploit this vulnerability you found on so this is the scan for my Linux Kong virtual machine. I would like you to exploit this vulnerability. Do a bit of research. This vulnerability is also known as the shell shock vulnerability. So all you have to do is to go onto Metasploit, so do an exit, and if you do an exit -y, it takes you exactly out back to your your root shell. So here I can just do again msfdb run, and it says database already started because we started it before, and it's going to load up again the Metasploit framework. So what I want you to do, make sure you're able to do the first task, get a shell, all right, exploit this vulnerability of the MS17010, and then all you have to do now is to search for shell shock. I think if you can just search one word for shell shock, and you have to then find the vulnerability, all right, that matches, or the exploit, all right, the exploit that matches this vulnerability, and use that to obtain a shell, just like I've done for the Windows exploit. So that will be your task using the Metasploit framework. Okay, so I hope this video is very useful. You've learned some sort of basics. Some other things that you need to learn are some of the other commands. So let's say, for instance, the eternal blue that we did before, something skipped my mind. Let's search for the eternal blue. Search eternal blue. And let's use 1 like we did before. There are some advanced options. So you can do advanced. I think it's advanced or advanced. Advanced. And there are other additional advanced options depending on the type of exploit. So in some scenarios, I have a look at the advanced options. Sometimes you might have to set some parameters for in the advanced options that will allow you to probably get a shell. So playing around with Metasploit framework, understanding some of these parameters. I'll probably have a look at the advanced, look at if there are any sort of yes that you think you might require to choose from, and set those parameters as well. So hopefully you're able to do this yourself, and I hope that this video is useful. Alright guys, thanks for watching, and I shall talk to you some other time. Take care.